Right now, millions of people in Cuba are living in total darkness. The national power grid has collapsed, paralyzing the country's infrastructure. Without power, essential services like hospitals are completely offline, unable to run even basic equipment like X-rays or operating theaters. This systemic failure stems from two overlapping pressures. First, the decades-long U.S. economic blockade. Second, the recent loss of cheap petroleum imports after the arrest of political leadership in Venezuela, which effectively severed Cuba's primary energy lifeline. To keep the island running, a Russian oil tanker is making its way across the Atlantic toward Havana, into the teeth of the U.S. embargo. If the Navy intercepts that vessel, it places American and Russian forces in a direct, high-stakes standoff. To understand why Washington is willing to risk a geopolitical crisis over fuel deliveries, we have to look back. This blackout is the culmination of a deliberate 60-year strategy to force a regime change in Havana. In the 1950s, under the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, Cuba functioned as a playground for American syndicates. Mafia bosses ran the casinos, controlled the tourism industry, and extracted immense wealth from the island's resources while leaving the local population in poverty. That dynamic inverted on January 1, 1959. Fidel Castro took control of the country and immediately nationalized American assets. Ranches, factories, and banks were stripped from U.S. corporations and handed over to the Cuban state. Washington retaliated. The CIA launched Operation Zapata, recruiting and arming a strike force of 1,500 Cuban exiles. The plan was to drop them onto the island, spark a domestic uprising, and publicly wash America's hands of the assassination. But when Brigade 2506 landed at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, local fishermen spotted them. Within days, Castro's mobilized forces had killed over 100 of the invaders and captured 1,400 more, creating a massive public humiliation for the United States. The absolute failure of a direct conventional assault forced the U.S. to change tactics. They pivoted to a shadow war. President John F. Kennedy authorized Operation Mongoose. This was a multi-million-dollar covert campaign designed to terrorize the Cuban population into overthrowing their own government. The primary target was the island's economic engine, the sugar harvest. Cuba relied almost entirely on sugar exports to survive. CIA operatives and recruited locals systematically destroyed infrastructure. They blew up bridges, targeted power plants, and set fire to sugar mills and grain warehouses to cripple the supply chain. Parallel to the economic sabotage, the CIA authorized an obsessive manhunt. Declassified records and intelligence investigations reveal over 650 distinct plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. The methods bordered on the absurd. Agents laced his favorite cigars with explosives, contaminated his scuba diving suits with lethal toxins, and repeatedly attempted to slip poison into his coffee and drinking water. Under constant threat of economic collapse and state-sponsored assassination, Castro looked for the ultimate deterrent. He turned to Moscow. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw a strategic opportunity. The U.S. had recently placed nuclear Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, right on the Soviet border. Khrushchev decided to return the favor by secretly shipping nuclear warheads to Cuba. This surveillance image, taken by an American U-2 plane in October 1962, captured the San Cristobal launch site, triggering 13 days of global panic. Zooming in, intelligence clearly identified 8 missile trailers and director equipment to launch ballistic missiles capable of leveling American cities. Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine to block further Soviet shipments. American destroyers formed a ring around the island and began dropping practice depth charges into the ocean to force submerged Soviet submarines to the surface. Deep underwater on October 27th, the Soviet B-59 submarine was rocked by those explosives. Cut off from Moscow communications, and assuming war had already broken out, the sub's commanders prepped a nuclear-tipped torpedo for launch. Only the explicit refusal of a single commanding officer, Vasily Arkyapov, prevented a nuclear strike. The two superpowers ultimately struck a deal to remove their respective missiles, narrowly avoiding annihilation. But Washington never forgave Havana for hosting the weapons, locking the island into an economic embargo that remains to this day. Despite the punishing restrictions, the Cuban government entrenched itself. Fidel Castro held power for nearly 50 years, before passing the presidency to his brother, Raúl, outlasting 11 different U.S. administrations. During that time, Cuba positioned itself as a leader for developing nations by hosting the 1983 Non-Aligned Movement Summit. Alongside figures like India's Indira Gandhi, Havana projected strength and global unity against superpower interference. Today, under current President Miguel Diaz-Canel, that resilience is fracturing. The total grid collapse of 2024 has triggered the most severe domestic crisis the island has faced since the 1960s. And the geopolitical battle lines are repeating themselves. Once again, an isolated Havana is pleading for help, and once again, Russian vessels are crossing the ocean to break an American blockade. Whether that Russian tanker delivers its fuel or triggers a military standoff, the civilian population remains trapped in the dark. Cuba's current collapse is the literal physical result of spending 6 decades as a proxy battlefield between global superpowers.